Hi, I'm Luke, and today we're talking about The Eye of the World, Book 1 of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. My intent is for this to be the first in a series of videos that will cover each book one at a time. And in each video, I'm only going to spoil the book we're currently talking about. So if you haven't read The Eye of the World yet, stop watching this and go read it. You're going to get spoiled. They're really good books. You don't want to get spoiled. If you have read The Eye of the World, you're in exactly the right place. If you've read much further than that, then you'll still enjoy this, but just be aware that I'm not going to be using any knowledge from later in the series, so I may make predictions or other analyses. I may, talk about characters in ways that won't make sense as much later on in the series because I'm restricting myself only to the knowledge in each book that I'm talking about, which is something I can do because I have not read all the books. I just started reading them a couple of months ago. I'm through book 6 so far. But I'm actually basing the first few videos until I catch up to where I'm actually at right now on the blog posts I've been making on my website, cout.ninja. So today I'm going to be pretty much just reworking the script for my first blog post into a video format so I can make sure I don't accidentally spoil something with the knowledge I have from reading a little bit further. My intent for getting into these books is not just to do a summary. I'm not trying to do a book report. I'm not just kind of going through it like that. I think there's plenty of videos that do that. Frankly, just read the books. They're very easy to read. I mean, they're long, but they're perfectly accessible books. You don't need somebody just to explain them to you. My goal here is to really do a deep dive into the things that stick out. And what I mean by that is I want to capture anything that really shows off kind of the writing talent that Robert Jordan had, or any of the mythological references or world building. The direction I'm coming at from this is I would like to write my own book. And I'm kind of trying to see what a really good, well-loved series, what makes it so good, what goes into it. So with that in mind, let's get into it. So the first thing we have to talk about, I think this is obvious, but I guess everybody's going to like something different from the books. But we need to talk about the Myrddraal, because they're fascinating. I think they're really, particularly in the first book, to me, they stick out more than any other thing that Robert Jordan did here. And let's take a look at this in kind of a couple of different ways. So first off, just on the surface level, what's a Myrddraal? It's basically just a Nazgul. Robert Jordan was pretty clearly, we can call it a homage, or we can call it ripping off a little bit Lord of the Rings when he first started off. He deviates from this later on, or so I've been told, but the this first book is pretty much just Fellowship of the Ring. And on a surface level, the Myrddraal are basically Nazgul, who themselves were kind of this evil Valkyrie. That's a whole other topic for another video to go into all of the Norse references in Lord of the Rings, but basically evil Valkyrie. There's some world building differences, and there's also some presentation differences that I think really make the Myrddraal stand apart. In terms of just world building, the Nazgul, as much as they were great, they kind of they're spooky. They're sort of just the canonical. I mean, granted, Tolkien was kind of inventing some of these tropes, or at least resurfacing them from old stories, but in a modern context, they're not really as fantastic as what we've come to expect from modern media. I mean, they're basically just ghostly, strawn knights on horses. They have some supernatural abilities. Later on in Lord of the Rings, they're flying around, but when we first meet them in Fellowship, which is more or less the context we're hitting inside The Eye of the World, they're really just kind of spooky knights. A crew of strong knights on horseback would have been more or less the same if they were just wearing black clothes. The Myrddraal, right off the bat, have a little bit more supernatural element to them. The most notable is that their clothes don't move with the wind or even with their own movements. Their ability to sort of flatten themselves out and just sort of disappear. I actually have to wonder if there's a bit of some inspiration from Flatland there in the idea of being able to kind of just turn sideways and become invisible. And that's pretty cool by itself. We have that right off the bat, that they're not just sort of bad guys on horses. They are somehow not part of this world in the same way that everything around them is. They're apart from it, but they can still affect it. And that's right away kind of spooky. But it's not just spooky in a world building sense. They use this ability kind of in the way they're presented as well. And to explain what I mean by this, I'm going to have to just read a short segment. So here's a scene from partway through the book. Rand agreed fervently, but even so, he hesitated before stepping out of the alley into the square. None of the sparse scattering of people gave them a second look. Most did not look at them at all. But his shoulders nodded, waiting for the cry of "Dark Friend" that could turn ordinary people into a mob bent on murder. He ran his eyes across the open area, over people moving about on their daily business, and when he brought them back, a Madral was halfway across the square. This is just amazing. Every time a Madral shows up in this book, this is how it happens. It's always kind of towards the end of the sentence. It's just sort of, it's almost as if Robert Jordan himself didn't know a Madral was going to be in that scene. If I remember correctly, in this particular scene, this was actually a case where there was sort of a fake out scare earlier, where Rand and Matt are in an alley, and Tom comes in, and for a second they just see a figure, and they think, like the audience as well, we all think, oh my god, there's the Madral, and then it's just Tom. So after that fake out, when they actually step out of the alley, the tension's in it's crazy high. They're sure someone's going to spot them. They're not really looking for a Madral in particular. They're looking for anyone that's going to stop them. We already had the fake out, so we're kind of in that weird period where we're like, something's still probably going to happen, but like, oh, maybe this whole scene's a fake out. And then while looking around, suddenly there's just a Madral there. Like, you can see this almost visually. This would be, this brings me back to like the Matrix. We have like the woman in red that suddenly is an agent. Like you're looking around, you're thinking like, oh, I think I see something over there. What's this? And then you turn around and there's an agent right, at your back, because you were too focused on the woman in red. And here we don't have that. Instead, we just have looking at a crowd, and suddenly there's just a Madral there. Like, you can really, I at least, I can really see this. I can see just sort of panning over a crowd, and then suddenly you have the snap back where now there's somebody there and they're coming right at you. And this is just, I really like this. And this happens every single time there's a Madral. Like, you're never safe from a Madral coming up. Again, this almost feels like it's part of the sort of extra dimensional or otherworldly aspect of the Madral, that they're not there until they are, and then once they're gone, they're just gone. It almost feels like a Madral could just turn sideways and just crawl right up between the words in a sentence on the page. I absolutely love this. This really speaks to some of the cool stuff Robert Jordan was doing in here. And I haven't seen any of the TV show yet. I have no idea if they do a good job with this or not. But this stands out. We don't see this. It's very different from how the Nazgul appear in Lord of the Rings, both in the books and in the movies. When the Nazgul appear, there's sort of an aura of dread in front of them before they even arrive. Like, people are unsettled before they arrive. With the Madral, there's that same aura of dread, but it doesn't really hit as acutely, and it doesn't really hit as hard until they're there. Like we have in this scene, once the Madral shows itself and attacks, then everyone scatters in all directions. But it's not until it attacks that happens. It's really, the Madral isn't really there, even when it's getting closer. And then once it's there, it's completely there and everyone's terrified. That's completely different from the kind of slow creeping dread of the inevitable approach that we get in something like the Nazgul. So the next thing I liked is the Blight. Now, regions like the Blight have become more common in a lot of kind of modern settings, but I think it's fascinating to have it in this sort of medieval setting that we have inside the Wheel of Time. Like, if we're looking for a modern one, it reminds me of Deimos in Warframe. If you played that, the whole time I was in that part of the book, I was really reminded of being on Deimos in Warframe. For another fantasy version, I recently ran Out of the Abyss, the Forgotten Realms campaign, and the Blight also reminded me a lot of Zugmoy's plan for, kind of breaking free of her Abyss realm and conquering the Prime Material plane and covering it in this sort of decay. So I guess that's another sort of medieval version of it. But even then, Forgotten Realms, Dungeons and Dragons is very high fantasy. Wheel of Time, at least in this book, I don't know how it's going to go later on, but at this point, it's fairly low fantasy. We have some moments towards the end of the book where Rand gets some kind of real power. But for most of the book, we have swords, daggers, the occasional little bit of magic. But, there's really a bit of a juxtaposition here between the low fantasy and the high fantasy, where we have, the whole book we've been worried about the occasional Madral or a Trolloc, And suddenly we're in an environment where, everything is antagonistic, where the land itself, where every piece of it is bad and needs to be feared. What I also like about it is this sort of aspect on the growth part of decay and death. So too often in fantasy series, we have the big bad is in an area that's just dead. It's cold, it's lifeless, nothing grows there. We can definitely have some sort of like Niflheim, sort of like it's just like a frozen wasteland. It's a layer of hell or something like that. Perhaps a cemetery where all the trees are barren. Like it looks very good in a picture. It's very spooky. It's very relatable, to a person just standing out at night. We can all around like autumn, going into winter, we can think of times where we look outside and it looks kind of creepy like that. But I really love seeing this greater focus on how it's not just that things are dying, it's that things are growing wrong. We have this sort of decay here. It's, like when something dies, it doesn't just go directly from being alive to being a dusty skeleton. There's this whole in-between period that's really far creepier, where there's this decay, this sort of uncanny, valley aspect to it. And that's what we get with the blight. We have a region that's tainted. It's this like almost cancerous growth on the ground itself, where it's not a matter of simply cleansing it all. Like you can't, how do you fight something like this where even if you kill it, it'll just regrow? Even if you smash it, something will grow up from the remains. It was very fantastic. I think the wording on it, again, Robert Jordan was very good at really crafting the feel of a scene, not just the world building in terms of like the actual definition of what's happening, but the real, like, how it's said, how it's delivered. Like the blight felt wet and gross. It was slimy to me, and that really came across in the description of it. And again, I absolutely love that. So the next thing I liked is how good all the characters were. I mean, they all stood out. And that's very rare for a series like this. It's pretty clear that Rand's the protagonist, the primary protagonist, pretty much right away. I mean, it starts from we get more perspective scenes from him. It starts in his perspective. He's kind of driving a lot of events throughout the entire plot. But all the characters were interesting. Like when we shifted to another perspective, I'm kind of used to a lot of other series, like Song of Ice and Fire is a good example, where I liked some characters and I really didn't like other characters. So sometimes when we had a change of perspective, I oftentimes was like, damn it, can we go back to the other character? I want to see what they're up to. I don't want to look at this person. I want to look at that person. And I didn't really get that at all in here. Like, I was totally happy seeing things from Rand's perspective, but when we jumped over to Perrin for a while, it got to the point where I was enjoying that so much I didn't want to leave that one either. Like, basically every time we jumped into a different character's perspective, I was just thrilled to see how different it was. And then when we left it again later, I was simultaneously a little bit sad to leave their perspective, but also happy to see whatever I was switching into. And that's really hard to do. I don't know of a lot of books that do this. Like even very good books, I generally just kind of assume that this is something you can't do anything about. And you can really see here that Robert Jordan spent a lot of time, just a lot of care in making every character really pop on their own. We have, Rand kind of protagonist. He's very relatable, very likable. We have a character like Matt who, we don't see a ton of really in this book. He's kind of just sort of a scamp, but he's very different from the other characters. We have Perrin, just like his entire way of thinking is different from the others. We can really feel that he's like, they're all different people. And even the way their scenes are written, we can feel how different each section is. Like they're not simply in different places. They don't have different abilities. It's just, they're different people right down to the way that they think. We have Egwene, who's basically a shonen manga protagonist in here. She gets her letter from Hogwarts essentially, and she could very well be the protagonist. Like Rand, in terms of the structure of the book, Rand is clearly the more primary protagonist in here. But in terms of possibilities for the series, Egwene is in a great place to take that up. And it's fascinating to have so many characters doing this. And then, of course, we have Moraine and Lan, who are like almost a total different genre from the other characters. They're older. They have their own thing going on. They're mysterious. Um, it's really awesome to see just all these different characters having so much different stuff to offer individually. So the next thing I liked was kind of the same. So the characters are great, but they're also very flawed, and they're flawed in ways that make them more interesting. And that adds an additional element. It's not just that they're different. It's not that I like them all. It's that it's not just that. It's also that they all have their own flaws that make them feel more realistic. Like, Egwene probably stands off the most as sort of annoying, kind of bratty. I mean, given her age and everything that's going on, it's very realistic and forgivable. But she's also really, like, obnoxious. Like, you kind of get angry at her sometimes in scenes. I mean, you have things where she's dancing with Aram, and it's really hard not to be like, well, what are you doing, Egwene? Like, everyone else is being very serious right now. They're all, risking death. Everybody's worried about everybody else. And here you are kind of low-key cheating a little bit. But on the other hand, I mean, they're teenagers, and there is a lot going on. Like, there's a lot of stress going on. She's having a horrifying time. And you kind of can't blame someone for, in a moment like that, kind of trying to find just a little bit of a distraction wherever they can. And I really like that. I like seeing that, in the moment we can feel. I mean, in this book in particular, we see things more from other people's perspectives than from hers. We see Rand's perspective, we see Perrin's perspective far more than we kind of see what's going on with Egwene. So it's very easy for us to kind of side with these boys while being like, hey, Egwene, you're not supposed to be doing that. You're supposed to be faithful to Rand. But we really can't make that judgment. It's kind of, it makes sense. It makes sense. It's believable. It's understandable. And it's sympathetic. The boys as well have plenty of faults. Like, they're kind of dumb. They don't listen. They're making mistakes. Much of the drama in this book could have been completely avoided if they'd just been a little bit more just collected. They've been a little bit more mature. But they're not. It doesn't feel, unrealistic at all. If anything, it would feel unrealistic if they weren't a little bit immature. I mean, they're fairly young in this book. They're teenagers. And they're not used to this. They're under a lot of pressure. I mean, I'm in my 30s, and if I was thrown into this situation, I don't know that I would react maturely. So it's very hard to be angry at them or really blame them at all for acting like what they are. And I love again, it's not just that they're flawed too, it's that they're flawed in different ways. Like, we have Egwene doing some frivolous stuff, but then we have, like, Matt just really not getting how serious things are and not understanding the danger that they're in. We have Rand doing his best, probably doing a little bit better than, like, Egwene or Matt in terms of keeping things together, but he's also not always making perfectly rational decisions. Perrin, we have almost the opposite of someone like Matt. We have Perrin is just kind of really hyper focused on making sure he's not doing anything wrong a lot of times, and it's sort of like we can see all these characters are just doing something a little bit off, and I love it. And this goes into Moraine and Lan as well. Their flaws, I think, are even more interesting because in this case, it's not just that we have kids that are acting like kids. We have adults that, frankly, should know better, but they're not perfect people. I mean, how much of the conflict in this book could have been completely avoided if Moraine had just been, like, a little bit more transparent? If Lan had been just a little bit less harsh in his treatment to the boys? I mean, it's very clear to the boys right away that Moraine cannot be trusted, that she does not really like having them around. She doesn't really care about them. She clearly is more interested in Egwene as a person. We don't really, the boys don't really understand her mindset for all of this, but it's very clear to them. They're not being told what's going on. Egwene's getting her private little magic lessons, and the boys are getting essentially nothing. We have Lan is not really helping them do much training or anything like that. He's not trying to bring them in and say, like, hey, we're a team, let's do this together. They're being treated essentially as prisoners. And to some extent, even if they weren't kids, the fact that they're acting out makes sense. I mean, how was Matt supposed to know how serious it was not to wander off or take anything when he was in Shatter Logoth? I mean, every single time they've gone anywhere, Moraine and Lan have acted like if they do anything out of line, it's going to be the end of their lives immediately. And from their perspective, this is somewhat understandable. They're dealing with like life and death, the end of the world problems here. So of course they're going to be very serious about it. But I mean, they're not explaining why, they're not giving the reasons, they're not giving the details behind it. It kind of makes sense why the kids aren't really just taking their word for it. And a lot of that could have been avoided if Moraine had just kind of sat them down and explained some things. She doesn't have to go deep into it. She can just explain a little bit more about just, hey, what's going on? Why are we here? What are we doing? Some basic team building stuff. Like, this is really standard team management stuff that Moraine completely fails at and Lan completely fails at. And again, this is really interesting. You know, part of me gets frustrated by it and really wants our characters to be perfect people, but they're not. Moraine and Lan are doing the best they can, and you know, their lives, their training hasn't really prepared them for that. My honest impression of Lan at this point is that he seems like a very damaged person. He seems like someone that was forced to grow up too quickly, that was probably involved in some kind of military training very, very young. He really strikes me as the kind of person that might be good to have around if there's a fight, but probably isn't a great person to have around a bunch of young boys that need some leadership. He seems like he's way too tightly wound. He seems like he's been through some trauma that's really, you know, he's doing the best he can. Moraine as well. Moraine clearly feels as though she has the weight of the world on her shoulders, and she doesn't have time for niceties. She doesn't have time to be inefficient. And that's not the right mindset. And again, if she had done things differently, if she'd been a little bit, if she'd taken just a tiny bit of time to open up a bit more, to be more transparent, to be more inclusive, to try to actually build a team, then perhaps they would have been caught. But this really wouldn't have taken, I mean, it would have taken minutes just to have a couple conversations. They could have done it while they were writing. And she didn't. And I think that's awesome to have characters that have flaws like this. Again, it's even more interesting when we have it in these adult characters that should know better and simply don't. So the next thing I want to talk about is the world building. I know I mentioned a couple times, you know, let's talk about things, the technique and such apart from the world building, but let's get the world building too. And I don't mean the fantasy world building. I mean, that's great, but we don't really know a lot about the magic system yet. We don't really know a ton about kind of the overall struggle of good and evil yet. You know, we have some monsters and such, but I'm talking about just the actual world, like the cultures and the people there. We start off, and you know, I'm sure with the show coming out, this is kind of common knowledge that the racial mix-up in here is not kind of the default expectation for a fantasy work like this. But going into it, especially if you're looking at the covers, the versions I've been reading at least, you could definitely assume that this is all happening in, you know, one small region of Europe if you don't read the actual descriptions of anything. You just go in blind, just assuming, all right, this is going to look like what I'm expecting. But it doesn't. We have, in Emond's Field, we have Rand stands out because he has relatively fair skin and very red hair. Now, granted, he's a farmer, so I'm sure he doesn't look, you know, like a redheaded software engineer, but nonetheless, his skin is light enough that it sets him apart, and his hair, far more so, sets him apart from the people he's living with, who have fairly dark skin. Based on the description, I'd guess probably more like Indian, maybe kind of that surrounding region, less African, but regardless, not Irish, which is interesting because the names and the cultures of Emond's Field all feel very Irish. So that's interesting. We have, you know, we already have some diversity. We can see that Rand sticks out, but he is there. There are different races of people, and they do connect sometimes, even in a very remote village like Emond's Field. And we've already seen as they got out of there and they started traveling further that there are other races and other cultures in the larger world. This is a full, real feeling world with a lot of diversity. You know, that's something that's often missing from fantasy works, where everybody will kind of be the same. And at no point in recorded history was there really any place where everybody was exactly the same. You know, perhaps in a remote village, you know, minus one or two people or the occasional, you know, merchant or something. But if you're getting to a big city, you're going to start having more cultures and different looking people. And we're already seeing some of that. And I'm really excited to see where that's going to go later on in the series. I would love, we haven't gotten too much on the different clothing styles and, like religious customs and stuff like that. Yeah, we've got a little bit, but not a ton. Religion in particular, we haven't seen much of. So I'm curious to see if we're going to see more of that going forward. But it's really fascinating. This feels very real. It's almost daunting as someone that would like to write some books in the future that this feels very well researched and very thoroughly built. And on top of that, we also have sort of the mythology inside here. Like we can definitely see some different mythological inspirations for things, but it seems as though some of those are even like in universe, they're kind of understood to be myths to some extent. But then some of them are also historical. So like we have, Arthur Pendrag Tamriel. We have this obvious kind of King Arthur-ish character. We have places like Camelin, which is right out. Camelin is literally from an Arthurian story. It's like we have things here that are taken from myths and made real, and it's very ambiguous, really, how much of this is just Robert Jordan, the author, taking inspiration from mythology versus this world having myths and legends that are perhaps the same as our own. Probably the most interesting example that I caught, I'm sure I missed some, but we had Len and Salia, who are clearly, that was John Glenn and Sally Ride. Just want to double check I had the right names there. But that's really weird to see some actual things that have happened in our lives, or recent history, turned into a legend here. We had what was the other one that stood out? There was the war between Merc and I need to look that up. Yeah, that was it. It was Merc and Mosk fighting with their spears of fire. That's really interesting to have these kind of like real events being spun in. They almost feel like Easter eggs sometimes, but it's deeper than that, isn't it? It's not just sort of a nod from the author. It's kind of like, aha, an attentive reader might have noticed where I got my inspiration from. This feels like a world being built with its own mythology, its own references, its own legends. And that's really interesting. So the next thing I liked is the period-specific stuff. So what I'm talking about here is things like scale. I really like how the kids from Emmons Field have this sense of awe at the cities as they're traveling. Like, this reminds me, like, I'm from a fairly small town in Wisconsin. And I remember when I first went to college and saw some of the big buildings there, I did the kind of embarrassing walking around, like like someone, that had never been in a city before, because I really hadn't been in many cities. And I really was awestruck at these huge buildings everywhere. Then later on, I lived in Japan for a while, and I was walking around Osaka, and I did the same thing again, because as tall as the buildings are in Madison, Wisconsin, they are nothing compared to the buildings in Osaka. And I love seeing how these villagers had that sense of wonder at the idea of, like, a town with more than one inn. A city that is big enough to have like a big wall. Just these. It's not just that there was this difference there, but it felt very real to me. Like this really, it came off as legitimate. It didn't feel condescending. It didn't feel, shallow. It really felt very realistic to me, the way that they kind of were awestruck by this, but then also just like a little bit embarrassed about it, where they're kind of like, oh, well, it's, of course, they're kind of embarrassed. And this happens multiple times. They're going on. It's like, oh, wow, it's even bigger this time. And it's like, I have to wonder how many more times it's going to happen in the series where they're going to be like, wow, I can't believe, sure different from plowing a field, isn't it? And that's really cool. I like seeing that. It really adds a lot of realism to this. The other thing that I really liked about kind of the scale here was sort of how people were spread out around cities. So there's a great blog I like to read, ACOOP, a collection of unmitigated pedantry. It has a series on the lonely city trope in fantasy, where you have sort of a city with nothing around it, just sort of on its own little pedestal, which makes a great picture. It's great in artwork, but it's not realistic at all. It's actually funny inside his series. he'll explain that the Lord of the Rings movies do this, but the books do not. And in Wheel of Time here, we also have Robert Jordan does a very good job of not falling into this trope and instead doing things more realistically. We can see as you get closer to a city, there's still people living outside of the city, and then slightly further off, still the occasional farm until you get to like almost wilderness. And then we start seeing more and more civilization again as we get closer to another city. This was very realistic. It felt real, and it also served a real plot element as our characters are trying to find places to stay. And it's easy when you're in a city where you have your pick of inns. It gets harder when you're like, well, there's a farm here. If we can't stay here, then we have to either sleep outside or we have to hope we come across another farm in the next, so many miles. And it's very interesting. I really liked reading this. Like, just the travel portions of this. I would never have thought that I would have liked them so much. Going into this, I would have thought that I would have been more focused on the fantastic elements, battles, magic, exciting stuff. But I actually found I was really engaged in just like, where are we going to sleep tonight? Like that's so cool that we can have that. Adding to that, we also have horses. This is one of the only fantasy series I've ever read that actually treated horses like horses and not like motorcycles. Horses need to be cared for. It requires a lot of work to take care of a horse. They need to be fed. They need to be taken care of. They need to be sheltered. They need to rest, which people often forget that horses need to rest fairly often, actually. You can't just run nonstop or your horse will die. And that actually comes up in here. And it actually is a major motivating factor in the plot. We even have characters with some personality. Like Bella is as important as many of the other characters to me. Like this is a real character of the story with its own personality that other characters interact with. And that is really cool. We don't see that often enough, but it feels real to me. Like if you actually have to take care of an animal I've had pets, but horses are pretty high maintenance. I've never had a horse, but it seems like it's harder than having like a dog. Like there's a lot you have to do. They're fairly delicate. Like horses can break their legs if you make them do stuff in unfamiliar terrain or when it's too dark or something like that. And if they break their leg, there's not a lot you can do about it. And if you're relying on that animal to live, then you better not break its leg. That's going to be a real problem. So I love the attention spent actually treating the horses like horses and not just, motorcycles or bicycles or something that you can kind of just, summon like, a World of Warcraft mount whenever you need it and then kind of forget about it afterwards. Like, no, the horses are traveling with them. They're part of the team and they need to be managed as much as anyone else in the team, sometimes more. The other thing I really liked here, and this is very specific, but the risk people are willing to take in order to witness something personally is just fascinating to me. When I first saw this, when I saw that like, all right, we have, the false dragon being run through town, it felt odd to me that people would care so much about running to see it in person, that like Rand really wants to go and see, he wants to actually, with his own eyes, actually witness this moment and be there for it. And it felt a little weird to me. But as I thought about it, I kind of realized, well, that's a very modern way to look at it. I mean, I don't have to see something in person because I'll catch it online later. I'll read in the news. Someone else will tell me about it. Like it's going to be common knowledge. If it's worth watching, then it's going to be recorded from 20 different angles. That's not the case in this society. That's not the case for most of human history. If you want to see something, if you want to really know, then you had to be there. And if you weren't there, then the best you could ever do is just trust that someone else was giving you the real version. And they might not. In fact, they probably were getting parts of it wrong because most people weren't even going to really write it down. I mean, some people would, but if you're just a common person learning about some major event, how do you know the person isn't exaggerating? If you are a performer and you want to have a version of that story, you kind of need the legitimacy offered by being able to say, I was there. And because of that, many people are going to just lie and say they were there even if they weren't. And if they want to have a better story, they're going to embellish the details. So it kind of does make sense that people would want to risk, they'd be willing to risk a lot, to risk their lives in order to see something that is this big of a deal. And I thought that was just very interesting. It really made me think for a minute because, again, for a moment, it felt kind of weird where it's like, what are you doing? Like, Rand, come on, like, why are you going outside? This is not the time for this. You just gotta wait. But I mean, when else is he gonna see this? Like, if he doesn't see it, then he'll never have seen it. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is the ending. So the ending, in one sense, I thought it was kind of rushed. I mean, it was kind of rushed. It really felt a little bit like Robert Jordan was just sort of done with this book and just wanted to call it. A lot of loose ends are tied up in a single moment. Rand just sort of, eats a bunch of magic and then teleports and destroys the whole army of badness, and then everything's fixed. It felt a little too convenient. On the other hand, there are a couple things I liked about it. So the first is I like how abstract it was. I think that actually heightens the fantastic nature of the magic. I think if you can spell it out, if it feels like you're picking abilities in like D&D or something like that, then it takes away some of the kind of fantastic element of it. There's some appeal to having it be sort of a jumbled abstract mess of just stuff that's happening. And that's kind of cool. I think there could have been, I think that still could have been done a little bit better, but it was pretty cool. The other thing I like is how Rand is just immediately certain that he did it. He killed Shaitan. It's over. Problem solved. And I mean, we haven't gotten even out of this first book yet. There's there's a bunch more books coming. Like, we know that it's not all just wrapped up. We have Moraine kind of warning Rand, being like, hey, let's chill out on trying to call down the Dark One, see what goes on here. I mean, we didn't get like a body. We didn't get, any evidence that things are actually fixed, other than Rand said so. I mean, certainly he solved the immediate problem of the army that was gathering, but it's clearly not over. And I kind of liked that Rand just immediately is certain of it. Because, like, why wouldn't he be? I mean, at some point, like, why wouldn't he be? In the moment, he thinks he did it, and he's thrilled with that. And he does kind of need Moraine to be a little bit like, hey, Rand, there's like a bunch of books left. I think we're going to have to maybe chill out and make sure it's actually okay. I mean, again, we don't have a body, which, I mean, this is very different from, like, earlier in the story where we don't get a body for Tom. And, in that case, it's very tropey. So it's kind of like, all right, do we go with the trope of the kind of somewhat wizened, like, older character sacrificing himself early on in the story? Or do we go with the trope of, well, we didn't see a body, so he's definitely going to be back? We don't know for sure right now, but I mean, even like Lan and Moraine are kind of like, well, I think we would have heard about it if there was a dead Gleeman in the middle of town. That's one where there's no body, and it's kind of like, all right, Tom's probably coming back. This is even a little bit different from that, where it's like Rand thinks he won the battle against evil, and it's just kind of over. And it's kind of neat. I like that. But speaking of sort of death scenes and bodies and all that, I also really liked Tam's death scene. That was just fantastic. I really loved that a lot. I don't want to say it's just funny, but it's really good. Like, I mean, in some ways it's actually very serious. That I like how it wasn't clean at all. That's a trope I hate in stories, where they have death always be very clean. It's very final. There's a lot of closure to it. Like, I certainly remember when my father died, you don't maintain, perfect mental abilities right up until the exact second your soul leaves your body. Things kind of break down. People can get a little bit incoherent. You very rarely are going to have someone have the perfect last words that make perfect sense and don't leave you kind of being like, wait, what was that? Like, can you explain that? Like, I kind of liked that Tam was sort of just rambling, ranting nonsense that was actually really making Rand very uncomfortable. That, like, Tam really needed to explain better, rather than just like leaking some really important stuff and then not being able to go into it. And I really liked how that felt realistic. Like, this felt like a much better depiction of death, particularly a death like this, where it's, it's not someone that was just stabbed and bled out. This is someone kind of dying over a long period of time. And, I mean, not an extremely long period of time, but like over, minutes and hours, not seconds. It's not, someone has a gun to their head and has a last word and then that's it. This is someone slowly dying from a wound, and it felt more realistic, which was then even better. They didn't even die. Like, that is just fantastic, because I mean, that happens too. And it's not just kind of that this happens. This really kind of drills home to me, like you almost get the impression Robert Jordan has seen some death. Like, he understands that it's a little bit random. Like, Tam could have died or he could have lived, and it really wasn't based on some heroic struggle. It wasn't based on some big good and evil thing. It kind of just came down to, like, can you find someone to heal him in time? I mean, obviously, this is a magical universe. Like, there are, magical elements to moments like this. But to some extent, it really does just kind of come down to, like, can you find someone to help in time? Like, magic doesn't have to enter into it. If there aren't enough beds, if you can't get someone, like, if traffic's bad and the ambulance can't get there in time, then a person that might have been completely fine with medical attention could die, simply because they couldn't get someone to help quickly enough. Someone can fall down in a room and, just die on the floor over days if nobody finds them. Like, it's this kind of random aspect of death in here that, it's both messy and it doesn't always happen like or when you expect it to. And I really liked that. And I just love that we see both those angles from one character, and he's still around. Like, I'm really curious how much more we're going to see of Tam as the books go on. All right, so we're getting close to the bottom of my list of stuff I liked about this. I did like the Jolly Green Giant, the Green Man. There's not a lot to say about that, I guess. I liked him. He was cool. I mean, of course, we'll never see anything of him ever again, being a nature spirit with a tree growing afterwards. I'm chuckling because I have my blog post open just for notes here, and I have a picture of the Deku Sprout from The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. So I'm kind of hoping that we're going to see this character again, but it's hard to say. I mean, maybe we won't. But in any case, I thought it was cool. Like, he was a cool character. I love characters like that, the nature spirits. He was a little bit more fantastic than what we've seen so far. Had a little bit more of that magic element to him. He was a cool character. I really liked having him in there. I hope we see more of him as the books come on. All right, so wrapping up, I know I've mentioned it before, but I do need to say again, this is kind of just Fellowship of the Ring. There's nothing wrong with that. I think really there's a couple ways to look at this. So just looking at it as a critic, this is very similar to Fellowship of the Ring. We can see the clear inspiration, homage, perhaps even a little bit of theft going on in there. We can compare the two and see what the differences are. That's kind of interesting on its own right. But I'm also, or really primarily interested in what this means for anyone that wants to write their own book. Because I think it's pretty safe to say that Wheel of Time is very successful. This book clearly rips off Lord of the Rings a lot, and I wouldn't say nobody cares, but it certainly didn't tank it. So I think there's a message here, for aspiring authors that, I mean, you don't want to just steal from people, but I mean, essentially all writing is at least a little bit derivative. And even if people can identify it, like, even if you don't really shave the serials off that well and people can really tell where your source material was, if what you write is good, if you have something to add to it, if you are a good writer, if what you write is good, then people don't seem to care. So I like seeing this. This is definitely something I struggle with whenever I'm writing. Like, anytime I'm writing something, if I discover that it's been done even a little bit before, I feel like I have to just crumple it up and throw it out. We're like, that wasn't really a new idea. And I think there's a message here that I should stop doing that. And I imagine other authors probably do the same thing I do there. Certainly other unpublished authors probably do this a lot. I guess probably most published authors learn to get past this. But I think this is just a good example of a book that is definitely derivative in some ways, and it's fine. Just do it. or don't, but don't worry about it, or don't worry about it that much, because you can still make a fantastic, famous series of books, even if the first one is kind of just Lord of the Rings. So that's what I liked about The Eye of the World, Book 1 of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Again, I'm kind of reading this one from the blog post that I posted a while back. I have a few more videos I'm going to do that are kind of like this, where I'm sort of just reading out loud blog posts I did and trying to stay pretty tight to them so I don't accidentally spoil something from further on down the series. Eventually I'll catch up to where I am, and then I'll start just doing the videos live. I'm not sure exactly when I'll have it out. This is my first real video that isn't just an introduction video. I might need some better equipment. I see my camera is it's doing all right, but I know it's been doing some autofocus stuff occasionally, which can be a little bit annoying. I'm not sure how my sound quality is, so I'm sure there's some things I'll want to clean up here. So it might be a few weeks, might be a few days. I really don't know at this point. I'm still kind of getting this figured out. But if you liked what I put together here, please leave a comment, like, subscribe. Let me know what you liked about this. Let me know what you didn't like about this. Should I do more cuts? Should be more dynamic? Would be more interesting if I was kind of standing or moving around more. Should I have more pictures involved? Should I have better editing? I guess better editing is an easy one, but just really anything that you feel like could be added to this, please let me know. Really, any feedback would be fantastic. Even if it's mean, I'll still read it. I don't mind. I really would like these to be good, and telling me it's great doesn't really help me. So let me know what I can improve on. All right, until next time. Thanks for watching.